My name is Bart Nijssen. I'm the chair of the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and I would like to welcome you all to the Daniel and Irma Evans Lecture. So this is a lecture that's held annually, and it was a lectureship that was endowed by Dan, Roger, and Robert Evans to memorialize and honor the human and broad societal outlook of their parents. Daniel Lester Evans received his engineering degree with honors from our department in 1917 and served for a long time in engineering positions in the Seattle area, including as King County Chief Engineer. The lectureship provides an opportunity to deepen the understanding of engineering by exposing students and practicing engineers to the concept, challenges, concerns, and methods they will use throughout their careers. Many assume, actually, that the Evans Lecture is named after the former governor, like the Evans School. Instead, it was endowed by him and his brothers to honor their parents. But Governor Evans is also a graduate from our department. Actually, he got both his bachelor's and his master's here in 48 and 49. He and Nancy were avid supporters of these activities and these lectures, and joined many of them. Both passed away last year after long and truly remarkable careers in public service. Not long after Dan Evans passed away this fall, Dennis Lettenmeyer, a emeritus faculty in our department and currently a professor at UCLA, called me up and basically said, so what are we doing as a department to cement the connection with our most distinguished alumnus? I didn't have a good answer. But fortunately, Dennis already knew what he wanted to do. He suggested that the department should establish a chair in Governor Evans' name. It would provide faculty support and honor the legacy of Dan Evans. Things moved actually very quickly after that. Steve and Sylvia Burgess generously decided to support the idea, and Mary Kellen, my wife, and I decided to join to ensure that the initial commitment would meet the minimum threshold for a professorship. So as chair, I thought this was really important because I've seen how hard it can be to support our amazing faculty, and I'm glad to be able to join in creating some resources to do so. We discussed the idea with the Evans family, and we have some people from the Evans family in the audience here as well, and they were supportive, as long as we coordinated with the Evans School and there wasn't any confusion. So today I'm pleased to share that we've established the Daniel J. Evans Endowed Professorship in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. The future holders of this endowment will carry the prestige of the Evans name while working in service to our field and our department. We don't want to really stop there. Our goal really is to raise additional donations and grow the endowment from a professorship to a chair. You'll learn more about that opportunity in the coming months, but for now I want to extend deep appreciation for Steve, Sylvia, and Dennis for establishing this meaningful professorship in honor of the incredible legacy of Dan Evans. All right, with that, I actually go back to my speaker of today, right? Because that's who we want to hear from today. It's truly my great honor to introduce Professor Kimberly Jones from Howard University in DC. Professor Jones is a professor in civil and environmental engineering and also an associate provost for faculty affairs. She holds a BS in civil engineering from Howard University, an MS in civil and environmental engineering from the University of Illinois, and a PhD in environmental engineering from Johns Hopkins University. Her research focuses on water and wastewater quality, environmental policy, membrane separations, global water treatment, and environmental justice. Dr. Jones served as chair of the US EPA's Chartered Science Advisory Board and holds leadership roles with the National Science Foundation and the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. She's also a presidential appointee to the Board of Directors of the National Institute of Building Sciences, where she advises on infrastructure and environmental resilience. Her work often centers on integrating equity into environmental research and policy. This morning I had a student ask me, how did you decide to invite Professor Jones for this lecture? Well, what I did last fall is basically I asked our assistant professors to provide me with a list of speakers they would like to hear from and who they would like to meet. And Professor Jones was near the top of that list and graciously agreed to visit us. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Jones.
Thank you so much, Bart, for that fantastic introduction, and thank you for asking to invite me from Washington, D.C. over here to come talk to you today. It's been my pleasure to get to know some of you. I've been in meetings all day, and it's been really great to see your campus, your gorgeous campus, by the way. It's my first time at University of Washington. I've been to Seattle, never here. Your campus is fantastic. And so you all are very lucky to be studying, living, and teaching in such a beautiful environment. And I think it's great hearing the background for this lecture, because I think it's great to be able to come, and Bart contacted me to come here. We had a meeting about this. I said, you know, what are the expectations? What can I talk about? I'm an environmental engineer by training. I do research in water quality. My lab, we design membranes for water treatment. But I knew the audience would be diverse. You're not all water and wastewater treatment folks. And so I was just wondering what might resonate among the things that I do. So I really decided, he gave me full rein. Actually, he said, you know, what do you want to talk about, Kim? And I said, I would really like to think about how we can integrate environmental research with policy and community engagement, because that's something that I've really been thinking about a lot more intentionally in the last 10 years, 10 to 15 years of my career. And so I'll talk to you a little bit. So this is not a technical talk necessarily. I wouldn't really call it a call to action. I hope it's more of a discussion. And so I hope to spend time at the end really having a discussion with you, answering questions, and then really just talking about the importance of engineering, policy, and community engagement. I actually have a pointer. All right, so this slide I felt was just a very happy one, because I think most of us in here are civil and environmental engineers. It's a career I chose many years ago, really because I chose to be a civil engineer, mainly because I wanted to design bridges. I said I wanted to be an architect. Then I said maybe I was good at math and science. Someone said, you thought about civil engineering? And I said, yeah, you know, it'd be great to design a gorgeous bridge. And then I had an internship my sophomore year, after my sophomore year in college. And I worked at a consulting firm with a civil engineer. He was a structural engineer, because that's what I wanted to do at that time. He was doing finite element analysis on a computer all day. I didn't think it was super interesting, but he was a great guy. And at one point he said, you know, I've been at Howard for decades. I'm kind of old. So this is a long time ago. But he said, have you ever heard about environmental racism? That's what it was. Environmental justice was then called environmental racism. I had never heard of that term. And he began to talk about what it was. And he said, you know, we need more people like you as environmental engineers to really have a voice at the table and really to sit and talk about that. So I decided that summer that I would change from structural engineering to environmental engineering. I said, you know, I really want to be able to have an impact. So I chose environmental engineering because I wanted to have a career that really made a difference and really had impact. And so, you know, best profession ever. I will talk a little bit about specifically what I want to talk about today, and that's environmental engineering, but also water. Once I started studying environmental engineering, I started doing research in water treatment. And started doing technical work in water. In my lab, we do membrane processes, and as I mentioned, we try really, really hard to make membranes cheaper. Membranes use a lot of energy, a lot of power requirements to get the water through the membranes. And so we've done a lot of work in my lab to reduce membrane fouling and really make that process cheaper and more accessible. But then I really started thinking again, this is circa 10 to 15 years ago, really I do work in my lab and I'm hoping I'm making a difference in some tiny part of water treatment, but there's this whole water issue that's happening, right? Water scarcity. We have a lot of places where you don't have access to clean, reliable, safe drinking water. So that really spurred me to start to think about how can I bridge this gap between research, implementation, and kind of affecting people's lives and really having a more positive societal benefit. And a turning point for me really was about 15 years ago, maybe about 10 years ago. I served on EPA Science Advisory Board for the first time. And I chaired the Drinking Water Committee, and I was a liaison to the National Drinking Water Advisory Council. And that's right around the time that we found lead in the water in DC. There was an issue. And we were starting to talk a lot about some issues with fracking. And I was sitting on the Science Advisory Board, we do quality review of reports, and we ensure that there's reliable science underpinning regulatory actions and regulatory decisions. And so we're sitting in the room and we're doing a quality review, which is very technical. You know, we're just reviewing all the technical aspects of this review. And EPA Science Advisory Board meetings are open to the public. Anyone can come. And then about midway through the meeting, all these people came with these water bottles full of brown water. There were people from the community who had learned about our meeting, and they knew we were doing this quality review, and they really wanted us to understand the impact that this was having on their community. And it really stuck with me, because I started to think, you know, we've been here, we spend weeks preparing for those meetings. We read these dense reports, we analyze them. And I said, you know, we're doing all this work on the science, but how, you know, what's our connection to this community? How can we make sure what we're doing today in this room really is helpful to these communities? And so that's when I really began to really think about environmental engineering research and policy, and how we as academics or researchers in environmental engineering make sure we are able to include members of the community. How can we make sure the work we're doing in our labs is really applicable to society and is really able to make society better? And as I said in one of my earlier slides, one of the great things about civil engineering is that we impact people's lives every day. They don't have a choice. You know, you can choose to buy a car, you can't choose, you have to drink water. You breathe the air. You know, what our designs and the work that we do impacts people every day. And so we have to really think about, are we really making people's lives better? And are we really interacting with the communities who are being affected by the designs that we're making? And so when I started speaking to my counterparts, other engineers, they kind of, not everyone, some people push back a little bit, like that's not our role. The lawyers and folks in government make laws and policies. We're engineers. They said, oh, Kim, that's advocacy. We don't do advocacy work. We're engineers and we design a code. But, you know, really, I don't think you can separate the two. I don't think you can say, okay, I'm an engineer, so therefore I don't have to be worried about the impact of what I do on society. And back in 1989, when they had the Exxon Valdez oil spill, that's really when a lot of folks started thinking about the role of engineers and how the things we design and we build a bridge and it breaks, people will die. If we build something and it pollutes the environment, people are affected for decades. And that's really when we began to think about ethics. So around that time, I think in 2000, ABET, our accrediting body for engineering, said that engineers should think about being ethical. We should not just design, and I know for those of you I was department chair through 2 ABET visits, so I know the ABET requirements, you have to really make sure you meet them, but ethics is in there. It is really something that we should really be cognizant of and think about as we do our designs. And I went to a meeting at National Academy, sponsored a meeting, and it was a collaboration between their NASEM Committee on Human Rights and National Academy of Engineers Cultural, Ethical, Societal, Social, and Environmental Responsibilities Engineering Program. So they came together and set up an all-day workshop, and that's where I met Bethany, actually. She was on a panel with me when we were really thinking about how do you bridge human rights and engineering. And at first it sounded like a weird coupling to me, because when you think about human rights, I don't necessarily think about engineering. But it was a great workshop, because it really started to think about, as engineers, we design to codes, right? We're very much aware of what design codes are. And that's what we use to guide our designs, right? And so usually when we think about codes, we're just thinking about numbers and how we can ensure that we meet the bar. But behind those codes is really safety, health, and the environment. You know, are people being safe? And so at this workshop, they kind of talked about a framework for engineering for human rights. And they talked about how there's civil and political rights. And so we have a right to education, food, health, housing, social security, and work, and how we as engineers can think about what are the social impacts of engineering and whether we can integrate that into engineering education and develop a workforce of engineers who are aware of how to do that. And I will also tell you today, and I should have mentioned this in the beginning, I'm going to introduce a lot of concepts. I hope we can discuss them. I'm not going to go as much into depth with all of them, but on most of my slides I do have references for where I got this, and if you have questions about getting more information, you can ask me during Q&A, or I'm happy to send you the documents. Okay, so back to water. So when you think about human rights and engineering, and when I was preparing for that workshop, I really thought about, inherently we understand that we should have a right to clean, safe, reliable water. But it is actually, in 2010, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution officially saying that the right to safe and clean drinking water and sanitation is absolutely a human right, and it's essential for the full enjoyment of life and all human rights. So it is a human right to sufficient, safe, acceptable, and physically accessible water. But yet, we have a global water crisis. We know that in many parts of the world, we actually fail to meet the bar of having water as a basic human right. Some people have to travel hours and hours every day to get water. Think about the impact of that on their lives every day. Some people don't have clean water to drink, so think about all of the avoidable deaths because of a lack of clean and safe drinking water. And think about just the fact that, just the stress and fear of not knowing whether or not the water you go and get every day is going to cause you to have some kind of an illness or to have some issues down the line, and the jobs loss and revenue loss from people who aren't able to work or become ill and unable to work due to waterborne diseases. But right here in the US, we also have a water crisis. A lot of times you're like, well, US developed nation, we have clean, safe, reliable drinking water, but the truth is we don't in many cases. You see these statistics here. There are a lot of public water systems right here in the United States that fail to meet EPA's regulations for safe, clean drinking water. They rack up violations. So a lot of these are in small communities, a lot of them are in rural parts of the United States, and they are drinking water that is not safe and is not meeting the bar that EPA set for contaminants in drinking water. And this is not, it is disproportionate to proportionate to where you live, your income level, sometimes your race and other things. So this issue of unsafe water is not evenly distributed across communities. It is isolated, and there are certain communities that bear the brunt of these issues. And so we see this. We see in the news that these communities are having issues with their water, and right here in the United States, where we are very, very intentional about having drinking water regulations, they fail to meet the bar. So I just want to call out some examples. In the Midwest, we have lead and arsenic in Indiana. Most people have heard about the lead in the water in Flint, Michigan. In New Jersey, they also had elevated lead. In Kentucky, they have infrastructure issues, so they had numerous water outages, boil water alerts, manganese contamination. In the southeast part of the United States, in rural Alabama, water insecurity, where they have unpiped communities, they have communities without adequate sanitation. Jackson, Mississippi, huge infrastructure issues, which you probably have read about, which led them to have to use bottled water. South Central United States, in Texas, water insecurity. Usually when I say water insecurity, that means they do not have access or sufficient access to piped water. So in some cases, there are some communities in Texas where the only drinkable water they have is bottled water. They don't even use the water out of their taps to drink in any way. Central Valley, California, issues with nitrates. Navajo Nation water insecurity, where I think 30% of the communities there do not have piped water. I pulled some from Seattle because I know it's coming here, but they have lead and infrastructure issues. I think they said 10% of the homes here do not have issues with lead or very aging infrastructure. In Portland, Oregon, similarly, issues with lead. Most issues with lead are due to old pipes, just infrastructure that needs to be updated. So all of these issues that, I forgot one. In Milwaukee, water infrastructure issues. So all of these issues, these are not general issues. These are water quality issues that have been found to affect communities vulnerable communities in a disproportionate way. So these are not general issues. These are issues that have been found to affect either Black or brown communities or communities that have a higher percentage under the poverty line, or where the predominant language in the home may not be English, or, so they have demographic indicators. And in a lot of these communities, they've been found that those are the communities that suffer these burdens disproportionately. But we have and this is what I focused so much of my work on for years, you design your water wastewater treatment plants to meet these regulations. So we have the Clean Water Act that protects receiving bodies, Safe Drinking Water Act that protects your drinking water, and together, it's a very logical process, right? EPA puts out regulations. I think they regulate 90-some contaminants. You have a water treatment plant, and it's the role of the engineers to treat the water to meet the contaminants, and therefore your water should be safe. But yet, there are a lot of water systems, as I said, that cannot comply. They cannot because they don't have the funds. A lot of them are in rural communities. They're these small communities that have water systems. So here we have the number of violations as a function of year. And you see these vertical lines, and these vertical lines are about the time that you had a new water regulation. So you have a new regulatory action, and what happens is the drinking water systems don't have the infrastructure to meet the new regulations, and they start racking up violations. So you see these spikes, and these spikes happen right around the time you see these new regulations. And so those are the communities, and those numbers I showed you earlier, those are the communities that fail where some period of time goes by where they're not drinking safe drinking water. We can see what kinds of communities are. Again, this is violations per water system based on year. Here you can see the difference between rural and low-income areas have the greatest number of violations, followed by rural high-income areas, followed by suburban areas, followed by urban areas. And so it does matter where you live in terms of how many violations how many drinking water violations you will have. The graph on your right, again, just looking across the United States, I'll show a couple other maps of the US so you can just see where these are located. But this has water violation score, so the darker the red, the more violations, the higher the number of violations. As you can see here, where these pockets are, where you have these large numbers of violations. It is definitely collected in certain areas. Again, households without piped water. You can see here, the bluer it gets, the more yellow it gets, the more you have with issues. You see these in the upper northeast part of the United States, some in Florida. You can see where it is. And when you overlay that with demographic information, you can see that urban households headed by people of color are almost 35% more likely to lack piped water compared to white non-Hispanic households. And lower income households are more susceptible, even when you look at different housing characteristics, race, and regional wealth. And this is the last kind of slide like this I have, but when you look at the Clean Water Act enforcement, it does vary with race and income. So here's a hazard ratio. So this graph shows you have non-compliant, so these would be non-compliant water systems. You have communities with a higher than average percent of community members living in poverty, then higher than average percentage of Black and Hispanic community members. And if this goes up, the hazard ratio is defined as how much, when you have a water violation, how many more days will it take for someone to come and inspect? So that means if the number's above this dotted line, it's more likely that someone will come and inspect your non-compliant system. So logically, if your system is defined as non-compliant, you're 12% more likely to get someone to come out and inspect it. Actually, and the paper goes on to explain this, but if you're in a lower socioeconomic community, you're actually 22% more likely for someone to come and inspect your water system. If it's a majority black community, you're 3% less likely to have someone come and inspect your system. And if you're in a higher Hispanic neighborhood, you're 4% less likely to have someone come and inspect your non-compliant water system. And so the point of these studies is just to say that the variation is not equal when you look at these issues. Last slide for these. When you look at drinking water violations by race, ethnic, and language vulnerability, you see on the left all violations. So here, as you go from white to yellow, this is increasing drinking water violations. So if you see more yellow, they get a lot of drinking water violations. If it goes more blue, you have increasing populations of color. So very blue, more populations of color, very yellow, more drinking water violations, more brown, you have both. So in this area where it's more brown is where you have increasing number of drinking water violations coupled with an increasing populations of color. You can just see these are all violations, and then on the right, these are just health-based violations. So these are violations that may adversely affect the public health. So I would focus more on this graph on the right, and you can see here where these darker areas are located across the United States. I just want to put a PFAS slide here because that's what I think folks are thinking about now. And with this analysis, you see you have at the bottom an odds ratio. If it's 1, if it's to the right of 1, you are more likely to live near a community that's exposed to PFAS. On the left, less likely. And then they have different sources here, different sources of PFAS: airports, landfills, major industrial facilities, MFTA, our military, firearms training sites, and then wastewater treatment plant effluents. And so when you see here, residents under the poverty line are actually a little less likely to live near a PFAS source. Non-Hispanic black residents are 6 to 13% more likely to live close to a source. Hispanic Latino communities are, it varies from major industrial facilities, a little less likely, and for landfills and airports, either right around average or a little more likely. And it's not, there's some who argue exposure is really correlated with the average population across the United States. So we looked, there's a study that looked at census data. So I said, what would the difference be if based on census data, you looked at PFAS exposure and ignored actually the demographics of the area? So that's what this graph shows. So if you just looked at census data and tried to predict exposure, you get this expected graph, the number of households that live within 5 miles of a PFAS contaminated area. But when you include race and poverty levels, that's this observed bar, which is considerably higher. So here on the left, this is low-income households, and on the right, the same thing, but people with color. So you can see that it is not, you cannot just look at your overall population. You actually do have to take into consideration demographics if you want to get an actual indication of how communities are affected and how overburdened some communities actually are. And now I do want to talk a little bit about where the federal government is in all this, because federal government is in charge, EPA usually is in charge of setting standards for water. And we talked about how some of them are violated, but understanding how communities some communities are overburdened by this, you can really look at, this is a timeline of how we've become aware of this and what's been done. And so it starts with the Civil Rights Act in '64, which is really the legal basis by which we're able to really start to talk about environmental justice, environmental injustice. Then in the '70s, you had EPA and NEPA, so here's when we start to regulate air, water, chemicals, right, at EPA. And then in 1982 was really when people started to think about environmental racism or environmental justice. It started in North Carolina, where a community protested the placement of a PCB landfill in their community. And it was really the first time that an issue like that got national recognition. They protested, they came out in droves, they kind of got some attention. Ultimately, they lost their battle and the landfill was placed in their community. However, it did start kind of this national discourse on communities and the impact of putting these sites in communities, and it shed light on the fact that the communities are usually communities of color or poor communities where choices are made to place these hazardous landfills. And then in 1994, the first environmental justice executive order came out, which just asked federal agencies to include environmental justice considerations in regulations. And then not a lot happened until 2021. We had a number of executive orders about environmental justice, environmental equity, climate justice. In 2022, again, a slew of executive orders came out, all focused on environmental justice, climate justice, and infrastructure. In 2025, just this year, a lot of those were actually rescinded, and we have yet to see what impact they would have. But a lot of work. So what I'll talk about in the next couple of slides, really some work that I have been doing in my role as chair of the Science Advisory Board to address environmental justice issues and regulatory actions. So EPA had been thinking really seriously about just how do you include environmental justice considerations when you are thinking about regulatory action. So the executive order said, all right, you have to think about environmental justice is important, but then there wasn't really a lot of guidance on how do you consider it, like really how do you do it? And so one way to do it is thinking about chemical exposures for risk evaluation. So you think about communities. So you think about potentially exposed susceptible subpopulations, or PESS. Generally, those would be pregnant women, the elderly, very young children, immunocompromised individuals. So those are sensitive populations. Those are populations that you want to make sure you are protective of when you set regulations. So what they did was to try to figure out, should we be including vulnerable communities as one of these PESS communities? Can we identify these communities? Is that an additional community to add when we think about pregnant women and the elderly? Should it also be overburdened communities? And so they really start to think about how do you look at, because one indication of increased risk could be if you don't just have one chemical exposure, but you may have multiple exposures or co-exposures, because remember the graph a couple of slides before, you have some people who live very close to facilities that may be given out. It's not usually just one hazardous chemical, it could be several. So they looked at co-exposure, and this work was just beginning a couple years ago, but they started to look at co-exposure of chemicals. So what they did was they looked at industrial release chemical exposures to air in different geographic locations. They recognized that when you look at different chemicals, they may have different toxicological properties or endpoints. They didn't just add exposure, they just looked at what is the risk, and do you have more than one chemical, are you exposed to more than one chemical at a time, and they just looked at carcinogenic risk. So then they did two things. One, they just said, can we use this to identify these susceptible communities? And so then they looked at number of facility release, number of chemicals that meet chemical risk benchmarks for cancer risk, and is it a combination of chemicals? And then on the right, they looked at whether or not they can look, instead of just looking at one chemical, They will look at that chemical, but just try to determine how likely is it that that chemical will be present in conjunction with another chemical. So they looked at 2 different chemicals. They did a bivariate analysis. I won't go over this in detail because I'm looking at the clock and I'm getting close. But the point of this is they were able to look at air tox screen data to figure out that if you look at the number of chemicals exceeding the 1 in 10 million cancer risk, and then look at the likelihood of those chemicals being there in conjunction with another chemical, they could come up with this map over here, where you see if it's very pink, that's chemical A, which has a high cancer risk. And then as you see this blue kind of going to purple, this is where that high cancer risk chemical is present in conjunction with other chemicals. So it's really the start of their study, and they were just getting started. I don't know what the status is now, but they're really, the great thing about what they were trying to do is to try to get at this really difficult question is, how do we consider the effect of more than one chemical in a given population? It is not easy, but they're really just starting to really look at the data. Around October of last year, EPA Science Advisory Board also was asked to comment on EPA's guidance for assessing environmental justice and regulatory analysis. So the issue was, they had an executive order that said you have to include environmental justice issues, but they didn't know how. So they said, really, how do we do that? And there really wasn't a lot of guidance. So you have folks who were tasked to come up with risk assessments and to figure out, well, they were tasked with including environmental justice issues or concerns, but they needed technical guidance because remember, regulatory actions have to be based on scientific data. And so a lot of EJ issues weren't directly tied to the kind of data that's collected, the kind of exposure data collected in regulatory action decisions. And so, again, I have this up here because I would encourage, I don't know, I just thought of this. I don't know if it's still on the website. I have a copy of this if you want it, but it didn't occur to me till I just said it. At one point you could go on their website and see this technical guidance. I suspect that it may have been taken down, but it was a nice document because what it did do was it came up with how you can use some of the data that is typically collected when you have to make a regulatory decision, risk analysis for a chemical, looking at EJ screen, which I know it has been taken down, but overlaying demographic information with scientific data and monitoring information that's collected by EPA routinely, and how to use that data to really, at the front end of the regulatory analysis framework, instead of coming up with your analysis and then measuring what the impacts are on a community, right? So you can come up with an endpoint, and then you issue your regulatory action, and then later you find out, well, this has a disproportionate impact on a community. Rather than doing that, the goal is to think about those issues at the very beginning so you can anticipate these issues and prevent them from happening in the first place. I chaired the Advisory Committee for Environmental Research and Education until a couple weeks ago. We were de-established at NSF, but one report that we put out, which again is probably not, I do have archived copies of most of these reports, and I do know that this website is no longer up, but we put out a document on engaged research because we recognized that environmental engineering, we were seeing proposals come through that were saying, we want to do research with this community. Now we know that this is an issue with a certain community, so we're going to go do research with them. But when we read the proposal, we realized that often it was more like research being done to a community, or not with the community really. So in some cases they collect data from the community, they go do their work, and then they come and tell the community what they did with the data they collected. So we really start to think about how can we give advice to both NSF and the scientific community on how to do engaged research so that it is effective, so that you don't make things worse in the end, because what we found also was that some scientists, say a professor works in a certain community, they go out and they do what they're doing, and then when the funding ends, what happens? They disappear. The community is there. They don't come and go with funding. And so a lot of times you have these cases where there's this effort to partner with the community, and then all of a sudden the person disappears, they don't hear from them. Then someone else comes to partner with the community, and the second time around, this community is going, no, we put a lot of effort into, Dr. So-and-so who came, and it was great, but then, they disappeared. And so really, how do we build these partnerships and these relationships so that they're sustainable? So the community doesn't feel like you have these folks coming in and talking to you and engaging with you, and then they disappear, or they come, you don't really understand what they're doing, they don't include you in a discussion, you're not really sure what they're doing and why. And so really, how do you do co-production of your research? So go speak to the communities, do the legwork first to build a partnership. That's the other issue, and this is some of the advice we gave NSF. It's hard if you're funded for 3 years or 5 years, because it takes time to build relationships in a community, and then you do the research, and then you have the output. That's long, and when you're an assistant professor and you got 4 or 5 years, you got to get the papers out. It's just hard to do it. So we have given advice to NSF about how they can do, before you even apply for a grant, you can get a planning grant to really build those partnerships in a community, and then you can actually apply for the funding to do the work after you've been able to build those partnerships. So it's a really nice report to talk about really how to do it in a way that is actually helpful. And so just to wrap it up, I have a couple more slides just on interdisciplinary partnerships, community engagement, just the importance of those of us who are scientists at universities and laboratories. We should really be aware of what's happening at the policy level, because that is really where decisions are made for how our work is implemented, right? So we have to partner. We cannot ignore how, or not be aware of how the work we're doing will eventually impact regulations, because they depend on our science to make regulatory decisions. So we should understand how that's done. And lastly, we have to really speak to those in a community who will be affected by the research. And I don't mean at the end, so this graphic isn't great because it kind of looks like they're at the end. This means to be serpentine, where it kind of goes up and back. They have to be included at the front end. And when I say stakeholder, not just, water treatment facility is a stakeholder, but also those actually in the community, and identifying those in the community who will be most affected. I'm gonna skip this just because I am getting late on time, and I do want to spend some time with Q&A. I told Bart I was gonna be 30 minutes, and I was not. But just to highlight some partnerships that we've been able to do that have been very useful, I think. One, we have partnered with our local wastewater treatment plant, and they have been trying to go out into the community in Washington, D.C. So I have a student who actually graduated last year, but she actually has been working not just on experiments in the lab, but also we've been going out in the community to really see how we can do community engagement. And I highlight this because our students have to be part of this. This can't be, I know a lot of times our students are really just working in a lab, trying to get the data and trying to finish their work. But it really would be nice, if you're doing this kind of research, to bring the students along so that they understand how to go out and engage in a community and to really start to form these partnerships. I have to skip. This is something I'm doing that I think is really neat. I'm a commissioner in DC. It's the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin. And it's a commission, and we're made up of commissioners from DC, Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, because we make up the Potomac River watershed, which is part of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And so we really recognize that we all have to work together, because what affects this watershed affects all of us. It's a great partnership because it's an opportunity to, and this is, you probably don't recognize it because you're not in DC, but that's the mayor of DC there, and we're the commissioners, but these are the DC commissioners. But we come together, and we have just begun to work more with the communities surrounding the watershed, because before we had just been coming together, with the commissioners to really kind of share things like, we do all these analyses of water quantity because we have all these complicated agreements to how to share water. If water goes low in DC or Maryland, Virginia has to kick in and vice versa. So the conversation had been at that level. So just recently we have started to bring in members of the community and to have them really engage in a lot of these conversations just so that they understand what's happening with their water in and around the Potomac River watershed. All right, we have to partner. Everyone wants to collaborate with an engineer. It is a good thing to do. If you can work with lawyers, work with social scientists, work with other folks, partner with communities. This is kind of my call to action slide. And with that, I will thank you and try to end so we can have questions. Thank you so much.